Some phrases are so familiar, we never really stop to think about them. The Lord's Prayer is a perfect example. We've heard it, we've said it for literally 2,000 years. But what if all that familiarity has been hiding something? What if this prayer was actually born out of scandal, political revolution, and a kind of philosophical explosion? Well, that's what we're doing today. We are peeling back the centuries to find the radical, forgotten heart of this prayer.
Yeah, to us it sounds gentle, pious, maybe even a little tame. But when you dig into the scholarship, you find this incredible claim that when these words were first spoken, they were a revolutionary act. Every single line, every word, was basically designed to upend the entire religious and political order of the day.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? How on earth did a prayer that feels so safe to us now once carry enough of a charge to be considered scandalous? Well, the answer is buried in forgotten history, in the lost meanings of words, and in a political world that's been almost completely wiped from our collective memory.
All right, let's dive in. First, we'll see why the prayer lost its punch. Then, we'll get into the scandals hidden in plain sight in phrases like Our Father and daily bread. After that, we'll uncover its role in a peaceful revolution, before we put all the pieces back together to see this prayer in all its original, radical glory.
So first things first, why don't we feel that shock anymore? The answer is pretty simple, actually. Repetition. After centuries and centuries of being recited, the prayer has become what linguists call a dead metaphor. It was a phrase that was once totally revolutionary, but it's become so common that its original power is just gone. It's a formula now, not a declaration.
We say the words, but we just don't feel that cultural rebellion or the political weight they used to have. See, back in 26 AD, these were not comforting little platitudes. No way. They were the creed of a movement, words that would put you on a direct collision course with the authorities. To get this prayer, we have to try and hear it like they did for the very first time.
So let's see how this works. We're going to start with the very first two words, Our Father. This simple little phrase was, at the time, an unprecedented, totally taboo, and deeply shocking thing to say.
This slide really shows the massive paradigm shift we're talking about. The standard way to think about God then was Melech, which means king, a distant, powerful, authoritative ruler. But the Lord's Prayer just flips the whole script. It replaces that king-to-subject relationship with a father-to-child one. It just closes this almost infinite distance, swapping formal authority for this radical, unheard-of intimacy. And to really feel the impact of this, you have to go back to the original Aramaic. The word Jesus would have actually used is Abba. Now, this is not some formal title. This is the word a little kid uses for their father. It's way closer to dad or papa. To use that word directly to the creator of the universe, it was a stunning act of irreverence. It was an equalization that was jarring, and for many, deeply uncomfortable. And let's be super clear, this was not a normal thing to do. The source material points out that while, you might find a later, radical text like 3rd Isaiah referring to God as a father in the third person, no one, and I mean no one, had ever dared to actually address God this way, directly. It just wasn't done. The act of calling out Abba was a violation of deeply held religious custom. It was in itself a scandal.
But wait, the scandal gets even bigger. The prayer doesn't start with my father, it starts with our Father. That little plural pronoun, that might have been the most explosive part of all. Jesus wasn't just claiming this special, intimate connection for himself. He was inviting everyone, I'm talking tax collectors, prostitutes, the poor, the outcasts, to claim that exact same relationship. He was basically democratizing the taboo, handing out this radical new access to God to anyone willing to say the words.
Okay, let's move on to the next phrase, because it turns out that another seemingly simple request, "Give us this day our daily bread," holds a deep linguistic and philosophical mystery that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
Okay, here is the heart of the puzzle. The Greek word that we translate as daily is epiousios. And this word, it's a complete ghost. It's what scholars call a hapax legomenon, a word that shows up only one time. Not just once in the Bible, once in the entire history of known ancient Greek literature. That's insane. Homer never used it. Plato never used it. It only exists right here in this prayer. That fact alone tells you that daily is probably a really weak or maybe even wrong translation.
So if it's not daily, what could this bizarre, one-of-a-kind word possibly mean? Well,
While nobody knows for sure, scholars believe it points to something way more profound than just physical food. The word's roots in Greek philosophy hinted a meaning more like supersubstantial bread, a kind of powerful spiritual nourishment, the very essence of life you need to fuel a revolution.
So what this all points to is that this is not a prayer for a sandwich, not at all. It's a demand. It's a demand to experience the kingdom of God that transformed spiritual reality right here, right now. You're asking for a taste of the future, a direct hit of spiritual transformation that will fuel the work of changing the world in the present. It's a prayer for revolutionary fuel, not just a meal.
Okay, so we've looked at the scandalous language. Now, let's zoom out. Because this prayer wasn't spoken in a vacuum. It was the creed of a movement that had a very clear political agenda, and it was rooted in a revolutionary tradition of Jewish thought. And this timeline just perfectly lays out the intellectual lineage Jesus was drawing from. His ideas didn't pop out of thin air. He was building on these late, radical strands of Jewish thought. We've already seen the influence of later prophets like 3rd Isaiah. But even more important, according to our source material, was the book of Daniel. It was written only about 180 years before Jesus, and it provided the direct template for his entire political and spiritual worldview.
The book of Daniel, chapter 7 in particular, gave people this powerful and frankly terrifying metaphor for the political reality they were living in. It showed the world's ruling empires, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, not as legitimate governments, but as monstrous, violent beasts climbing out of the sea to just devour and destroy everything.
So this vision, this idea of empire as being inherently beastly, was absolutely central to Jesus' mission. The phrase, "Thy kingdom come," wasn't some fuzzy spiritual wish. It was a political statement. It was a call to replace these violent, beast-like empires with a completely new world order, the kingdom of God. This was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Rome and all of the collaborating local authorities.
The Lord's Prayer, then, becomes the anthem for an organized movement dedicated to what our source calls combative peaceism. Now, this was not passive resistance. This was an aggressive, in-your-face, nonviolent war to change the culture. It meant being willing to die for the cause, a kind of militancy that you can see reflected in modern figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., or the Vietnamese monks who self-immolated to protest the war.
And this brings us to a really crucial point. The Romans executed Jesus, but not primarily for blasphemy. That was the charge the local religious authorities used to get him in trouble. No, the Romans killed him because they saw him for what he was, the leader of a revolutionary political movement that was a threat to their power. He was a troublemaker, and his call for a new kingdom was a direct threat to the stability of their beastly empire.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together, because when you restore the original linguistic, religious, and political context, the prayer is completely transformed. It goes from a tame little recitation into a radical manifesto.
This table gives us a great side-by-side look at that transformation. Our Father is no longer just a respectful title. It's a political act. It's claiming your allegiances to a heavenly parent, not an earthly emperor. Daily bread isn't a plea for lunch. It's a demand for the spiritual superfuel you need for a revolution. And Thy kingdom come is the movement's central, unwavering mission, the nonviolent overthrow of the world's oppressive systems.
When you get right down to it, the Lord's Prayer was a declaration of war. Not a war with swords and spears, but a far more radical war of peace, fought with the weapons of defiant intimacy, spiritual sustenance, and an unshakable vision for a totally different kind of world. It was the founding document of a peaceful yet militant spiritual revolution.
You know, this whole journey into the Lord's Prayer leaves us with a pretty powerful question. It shows us that the most familiar things in our world can hide the most radical histories. So it makes you wonder, what other ideas or phrases or rituals that we totally take for granted have become dead metaphors? What other forgotten revolutions are just hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to rediscover them?